It's week 8. It's hard to believe, but I welcome you to our Through the Bible. I'm Pastor Dave Shue, and I think we have all our technical glitches worked out, thanks to Paul Bodwin and Jim Anderson, and it's a joy to be able to be with you again this week. Just a few things from last week I kind of want to follow up on before we get into this week's material. My reading from last week's material kind of got me to think about, I'm not sure I made real clear some of the things around the idea of the Jubilee from Leviticus 25. It takes place every 50 years. I kind of talked about 49 years, but it takes place after every 49th year, in the 50th year, every half century. And it is an important time in the life of the Israelites. It's a time when everything is reset. I'm not sure I made clear either that part of how they made the Jubilee work is when people purchased land from one another, what they did was they figured out how many years there were before the next Jubilee and figured that into the price of selling the land. So if you were only going to have 10 years of use of the land before the land was returned in the Jubilee year, then you would figure that out as part of the purchase price of the land. So that would make it a way for the land price to be calculated in a fair way for people who are buying it, knowing that they would have to return the land at the year of Jubilee within the Israelite community. It's an interesting system, and I wonder if it would work in our real estate kind of system now. There are two interesting elements in the book of Numbers as well I kind of wanted to deal with as we got ready for this week. The first is a point you might have missed. Already we're seeing changes somewhat in the tradition as we move through the books of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. We often have this mistaken image that the tradition of the faith is kind of unchanging and timeless. But that's never been true within the traditions of the people of God, and we saw an example of that this last week. When we looked at the book of Exodus, you read the words, "The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, 'This is the ordinance for the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it, but any slave who has been purchased may eat of it after he has been circumcised. No bound or hired servant may eat of it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the animals outside the house, and you shall not break any of its bones. The whole congregation of Israel shall celebrate it. If an alien who resides with you wants to celebrate the Passover to the Lord, all his males shall be circumcised. Then he may draw near to celebrate it. He shall be regarded as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. There shall be one law for the native and for the alien who resides among you.'" That's from Exodus 12. But now as we come to the book of Numbers, we read, "Any alien residing among you who wishes to keep the Passover to the Lord shall do so, according to the statute of the Passover and according to its regulation. You shall have one statute for both the resident alien and the native." There's no talk here of circumcision as we enter into the book of Numbers, so it's hard to know whether that's still a consideration as we enter into the book of Numbers. And as you enter into today, those regulations are somewhat relaxed even further. I've been invited to celebrate the Passover with people within the Jewish community over time. Traditions within the community of the people of faith change as the circumstances they live in change. And we'll look at that even more as we move through other places within the Old Testament. But it's important for us to remember that as we read the Old Testament, as we think about our own traditions. Tradition is not a timeless and unmoving thing, but is often open to change. This is just to point out that faith traditions are always in the process of being shaped and transformed. And we need to remember that always. I also last week didn't point out an incident in Numbers 11 that's very important for us to consider. In Numbers 11, God authorizes Moses to call 70 elders to help with leading the people of Israel and gives these elders a portion of Moses' spirit. They're gathered together for this ordination, if you will, and they begin to prophesy when they receive the Spirit. Now that section also talks about the fact that 2 of the chosen aren't among the 70 who have been gathered together and are out in the midst of the camp, and they also begin to prophesy. This scandalizes some who worry that this will undermine Moses' authority. Joshua is among those who are worried. But when Moses is told about it, he speaks some powerful words. It says in Numbers 11, "But Moses said to him," Joshua, "Are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his Spirit on them." Moses isn't afraid that his authority will be undermined. Instead, Moses wishes that God would somehow inspire all people to be a part of the leadership of the people of God. That to me is an incredible image for all of us as leaders of God's people. In the end, it's not about us. It's about the mission that God gives us and the work among God's people and in the world. I know this was a powerful image for me, and I think it's an example for all of us to benefit from. And so now we move into week 8. Week 8, we persist in our reading of Numbers and the book of Mark. On day 1, we read Numbers 12 through 14 and Mark 5, 21 through 43. On day 2, we read Numbers 15 through 16 and Mark 6, 1 to 29. On day 3, Numbers 17 through 19, and Mark 6, 30 through 56. On day 4, Numbers 20 through 22, and Mark 7, 1 to 13. On day 5 is Numbers 23 through 25, and Mark 7, 14 to 37. On day 6, Numbers 26 through 28, and Mark 8. And finally on day 7, Numbers 29 through 31, and Mark 9, 1 to 29. In the book of Numbers, we'll be continuing the journey toward the Promised Land, and I thought it might be helpful at this point to give you a little image of what that troop looks like. So now on the screen, hopefully you'll be seeing a picture of the map of the trip that the Israelites are making from Egypt onto the Promised Land. It's a pretty simplified map of the route they take. Actually, finding the exact details of the path the Israelites took is much more difficult. Sometimes take some time to go on the internet or consult a Bible atlas, and you'll see that there are a number of theories about the route they took. But the basic progression is something along these lines. The Israelites leave Egypt. They eventually get to Mount Sinai, where we are in the story now. There they receive the law, they organize, they construct the tabernacle, and they prepare for the rest of the trip. They travel to the edge of the Promised Land. At Kadesh Barnea, spies are sent into the Promised Land, and the people, after the reports of the spies, are afraid of what they find. And so, for the lack of faith, they are forced to wander in the wilderness west of Canaan for 40 years. They seem not to have really moved far geographically, however, over the years. Then they return to the Jordan River and cross over into Canaan near Jericho and begin the conquest of the land. This journey is recorded in the rest of Numbers and in the book of Deuteronomy. So then let's look at the readings in the book of Numbers for this week. Chapter 12 of Numbers gives us a picture of dissension in the leadership of the Israelites. Aaron and Miriam do not like that Moses has married an outsider and probably are somewhat jealous of his place as leader. And so it says they speak against Moses. It doesn't say how public this complaining is, but it angers God, for Moses is the leader God chose. And so God punishes Miriam and Aaron by making Miriam leprous for 7 days. Why not Aaron? It's a good question. In fact, my group that I met with asked that question. I'm not sure. Other than that Aaron is the priest, and to make him unclean would have somehow disrupted the worship life of the people of Israel. Also, Aaron is a man, and this is a patriarchal society. But for whatever reason, Miriam is the one who receives the punishment. Moses pleads for her, but God says that some punishment is necessary. So for 7 days, she sits outside the camp. But Miriam is a beloved person within the people of Israel, and so they wait for her. She sits outside the camp, and finally her leprosy is lifted. She receives the ritual purifications and is received back into the people. It seems after this show, things are brought back into line. The people of Israel reach the edge of the promised land, and Moses chooses spies to send in to spy out the land. There's one leader chosen from each of the tribes of Israel. They go into the land and they come back with treasures from the land, beautiful grapes, fruit that they find there, crops of the land. It seems that this is a beautiful land with all kinds of wonderful gifts for the people. And yet, it is also a land filled with strong and powerful enemies. When they come back, the spies are all afraid of what they find there, except for Caleb and Joshua. Caleb, one of the spies, stands up and says, "Let us go up and at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." But the other spies say, "No. These people are far too mighty for us to conquer." All the people of Israel begin to whine again. "We can't do this," they say. "Why didn't you let us stay in Egypt?" Moses, Aaron, Caleb, Joshua all appeal to the people. In faith, Joshua and Caleb, who have seen the land, say, "The land that we went through as spies is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are no more than bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." But of course, the people don't listen. God is ready to strike them all down. God tells Moses, "I'll start over with you. We don't need them." But Moses persuades God to have mercy. Because what will everyone think if God has brought the people all this way and then destroys them? Moses appeals to God's love and mercy. And though God chooses not to destroy the people, he vows that none of the generation from 20 years old and up will enter the promised land. It will be their children that will go in. Only Joshua and Caleb will be allowed to inherit the land because of their faithfulness. God decrees that a year will be spent in the wilderness for every day that the spies were in the land spying it out. 40 days the spies were there, so 40 years the people will spend in the wilderness. And to make the point clear, all the spies except Joshua and Caleb are struck down by a plague. Well, now the people change their mind. They want to believe in God. They want to go into the land immediately and try to take it for their own. Moses tells them God will not go with you. But again, they won't listen. They're defeated and chased back into the wilderness. So now Moses instructs them on how to behave when they do finally get into the land. They review how to properly sacrifice and what to do if they unintentionally make a mistake. Then we have another disturbing section in which a man is killed for violating the Sabbath. But once again, we are reminded of the importance of respect for God. And then there's a section on an injunction that is given to wear fringe on the garments to remind people of how God saved them and the importance of their relationship with God and of the importance of the commandments that guide their life. The struggle to remain a faithful people is a constant struggle in the life of the people of God. It's a constant struggle for us. In the face of the new struggle of Israel brought on by their own unfaithfulness, there are new challenges to Moses and Aaron's leadership in chapter 16. People begin to say, why should Moses and Aaron be the only ones who can sacrifice to God? Are we not all holy before God? These challenges are met with the death of many of the people of Israel. In fact, the only thing that spares the people is that, once again, Moses and Aaron intercede on their behalf. Think about this. Moses and Aaron are the ones who are challenged by the people, and yet they turn around and intercede on their behalf. In the end, it is only their prayers, their compassion, that save the people. These images are incredibly powerful. How do we respond to those who would attack and challenge us? God then makes it clear that it is Moses and Aaron that are his chosen leaders. And these are the ones who are to be the priests, who are the ones to enter the tabernacle. These are the ones that God has chosen. And yet the people still complain and doubt. Some of the tension is lowered, however, as God assigns new responsibilities to the Levites in the worship life of the Israelites. Some of the work that Aaron does is spread out to others. Aaron is still the one who gives them oversight. And also they are now compensated with salaries, with some resources that are given them for the work that they do. However, their responsibilities are also now raised, and God expects them to take these responsibilities very seriously. And there are consequences for failure. Those who are close to the Lord always carry heavier burdens and responsibilities. That seems to be something that runs throughout the Scriptures. In Numbers 20, we finally see the humanness of Moses, the pain and frustration that finally seems to build in his life. And it finally brings a tragic place to his relationship with God. Again, the people are complaining, this time about water. How will they survive without water? Once more, Moses turns to God, and God tells Moses to go and get the staff from the tabernacle and to speak to a large rock, and that water will be provided for the people and for their cattle. But Moses has reached a breaking point, and this is what we read in Numbers chapter 20. So Moses took the staff from before the Lord, as he was commanded. Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock. And Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me to show my holiness before the eyes of the Israelites, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." Moses, in failing to follow the Lord's instruction, and trying somehow to show his own might in this process, and trying to show his own power, has forfeited his right to enter the land of promise. Somehow this passage has always really bothered me. Moses has done so much, has been so faithful. Where is God's compassion? Where is God's mercy in all this? Where is the fairness? And yet Moses accepts this. Moses recognizes that God is God. What an incredible example of faithfulness. And then Aaron dies. The priesthood is passed on to his son. The community mourns his loss. But again, immediately the people begin to complain. And this time God sends poisonous serpents among them. Moses constructs a serpent that he places on a staff and lifts it into the air, and all who look upon it are saved. This image becomes a way of speaking of Jesus later in the Gospel of John. In that Gospel it is written, "And just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life." Israel then asked for permission to pass through the lands of some of the kings of the region, and instead the kings send out their armies to attack the Israelites. The Israelites crush the armies and destroy the towns of these kings and seize their lands. The conquest of the land has begun. Another king, worrying about the Israelites, hires a diviner, a prophet, a soothsayer to go and curse the Israelites, a man named Balaam. Balaam, on his way to carry out this curse, is stopped by an angel of the Lord who stands in a narrow road waiting for Balaam. Balaam's donkey recognizes the angel there and refuses to go on. Balaam, in anger, jumps off his donkey, begins to beat it with a stick, and then God opens the mouth of the donkey, who turns around and tells Balaam what he sees. God then allows Balaam to see the angel there, and Balaam bows before the Lord. The Lord then says that Balaam is to do what the Lord instructs him to do. So when the Balaam then joins up with the king, King Balak, who wants him to curse the Israelites, instead Balaam blesses them. The king is frustrated and angry and thinks maybe if they move to another place, Balaam will do what he wants. But instead, Balaam blesses the Israelites again and prophesies that anyone who goes up against the Israelites will lose. And so Balak gives up his attack upon the people of God. Again, the people test God by having sex with women from the surrounding Midianite community. A plague begins to kill the people of Israel because not only do they carry on sex with these foreigners, but begin to worship their gods. Aaron's grandson, Phinehas, seizes a spear and runs forth and kills one of the Israelites in the act of having sex with one of these women, and kills the woman as well, and for his zeal saves the people of Israel. God then promises that Phinehas in the future will be one of those who is a priest of God forever. God promises a close relationship with Phinehas and his family. A census is taken among the people in preparation for their entry into the land. And during the census, some women come and speak about their father's death, how they now have no portion in the land to come. Moses then goes to God and asks about this, and a new ordinance is passed. If a man dies and has no son, then you shall pass his inheritance on to his daughter. If he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers. And if he has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the nearest kinsman of his clan, and he shall possess it. It shall be for the Israelites a statute and an ordinance, as the Lord commanded Moses. And so the women are provided for. This is a new place in the life of the people of Israel. These women who have had no status are provided for by the love of God. We are nearing the end of Moses' life. And so Joshua is chosen as his successor. And Moses begins to prepare the people for his departure. He begins to review all of the laws. First, he reviews all of the laws about offerings and vows made before the Lord, because this is the center of the people's lives, their relationship with God. Israel carries out a daring raid against the Midianites on the borders of the Promised Land. And in the process, much of the riches that are taken are brought to the Lord. It is recognized in this moment that victory will only come from the hands of the Lord. And so the future of the conquest of the land is set. And we will continue this vision as we read on in the book of Numbers. In the New Testament, we continue to read in the book of Mark. So far in the book of Mark, we have been seeing the growing resistance to Jesus from the Jewish authorities, the growing confusion of Jesus' disciples, the power of Jesus confronting the power of Satan and the power of the world. Now an authority of one of the Jewish synagogues comes to Jesus, a strange turn of events, and asks for Jesus' help. His daughter is deathly ill, and he wishes Jesus to heal her. Jesus responds and follows him to his house. But on the way, a woman who has had a flow of blood for years reaches out and touches Jesus' garment. Now, as we've already been reading in the books of Leviticus and Numbers, this action would make Jesus unclean. But Jesus isn't worried about this. He has felt the power go out from him, and he asked, "Who touched me?" The woman admits that she is the one. And what becomes important for Jesus is that she realizes that it is her faith, her trust in him, that has brought her healing. While all this is going on, people come from the official, Jairus' house, to tell them that his daughter has died. But Jesus tells him to remain faithful, to trust him. They go on to his house. Jesus goes in to the little girl again. To touch a dead body is to become unclean. But Jesus reaches out, takes hold of her hand, and tells her to arise. The little girl rises up. Jesus forbids anyone from telling about this miracle, as he does in so many other places. He goes to his hometown. But the people there are amazed that anyone who they know, who has parents who they know, should be able to speak like this. And their unbelief keeps him from being able to heal very many people there. He then sends his disciples out with power over demons and power to heal, sends them out to preach the gospel. And while they're out, John the Baptist is executed. A foreshadowing of what is to come for Jesus himself. Jesus tries to get away with his disciples then to pray, but a large crowd follows him. And it says as he looks at the crowd, he has compassion, for they seem so lost. It gets late and the disciples want him to send them away to get something to eat, but Jesus says, "You feed them." The disciples seem confused. How are we to feed so many? And he asks what they have, and they say, well, just a couple fish and 5 loaves of bread. Jesus then takes the food and feeds the crowd with food left over. Then he rushes the disciples off and puts them in a boat while he goes off to pray by himself. The disciples find themselves in the midst of a storm, unable to get across the sea, and Jesus comes to them walking on the water and then stills the storm. You'd think the disciples would be able to embrace this wonder, and yet, having seen so much, they still cannot receive what's going on. It says, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Somebody asked me during our session when we were talking about this, what does it mean to have your heart hardened? It means that they couldn't receive this. They couldn't be open to what was going on with Jesus. Now we might wonder about these disciples. But this book is also written to us. We are like these disciples. We too doubt in the midst of life, even when we've experienced God's love and God's touch in our lives. We doubt over and over and over again. Getting to the other side, Jesus is once more swamped by those seeking his healing. The scribes and the Pharisees once more challenge him, asking, why don't he and his disciples observe the ritual of cleansing themselves before eating? Jesus says to them, but the truth is, nothing that comes from the outside can go into us and defile us. Only that which comes from our hearts can really make us unclean. And then he challenges them, saying that they observe the letter of the law, but their hearts are never really in the law. And they often twist the law for their own purposes. So who is the one who is really defiled? Then a woman, an outsider, another person who could make Jesus unclean, comes to him and begs him to cure her daughter. Jesus asks her why he should do this. Is not what he brings for the Jews? Why should he give what is meant for the children to the dogs? This seems a harsh statement, and yet the woman, without missing a beat, says, but even the dogs should receive some crumbs from the table. Jesus then recognizes her faith, her trust, even above so many in Israel. And her daughter is healed. We see the gospel breaking out into wider and wider circles. They bring a deaf person to Jesus, and he opens his ears and he hears anew. Hears the good news when others refuse to hear. We then have the miracle of the feeding of the multitudes repeated, as Jesus once more feeds a large crowd with small resources. Then, as he is in a boat with his disciples, he tells them to watch out for the yeast, the leaven of the Pharisees. He tells them to watch out for the influence, the way the Pharisees think. But the disciples, as always, misunderstand and think they are being chastised for not having bread. And Jesus is amazed at their obtuseness. Jesus heals a blind man and again forbids him to tell anyone. And then, talking to his disciples, he asks them who people say he is. They say, well, some say the prophets, some say John the Baptist, but he asks them who they say he is. And Peter says, you are the Messiah. Now remember how Matthew portrays this scene. Matthew then has Jesus say, you are blessed, Peter, with this observation from God. But here in Mark, that's not what Jesus says. Instead, Jesus tells his disciples to tell no one. Why? because the disciples do not understand what it means to be the Messiah. We see this immediately after, as Jesus begins to tell his disciples about the necessity to go to Jerusalem and to die, and Peter immediately rebukes him. And Jesus must say to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, for you want the things of people and not of God." Jesus then goes and gives his disciples a very hard truth. He gives us the same truth as well. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. With these words ringing in their ears, Jesus takes James and Peter and John up a mountain to pray. And there he is transfigured. He shines bright and white before them and is joined by Moses and Elijah, symbols of the life, of the history of the people of God. His disciples respond in another inappropriate way, wanting to build booths and stay on the mountain forever, and a voice has to calm them down and says, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." And when they look up again, there's only Jesus. Now, some people in my session ask, what's the point of the Transfiguration? Within the story itself, it certainly is a time for Jesus to be strengthened for his journey onto Jerusalem and onto the cross. But for us who are reading the story and for his disciples, it's also an image of what is to come. Many have seen in this story a pre-resurrection image, here pushed back into the life of Jesus. We see here what is to come, the new life that Jesus will bring, even here at this moment. Jesus and his disciples then descend the mountain. They find the other disciples trying to cast out a demon from a young boy. They have failed miserably. The father then turns to Jesus, begging for him to cast out the demon. Jesus is frustrated with his disciples' failure once more. And then he seems to point out that it's in part, at least, due to their lack of faith. The father then cries out, asking for Jesus to increase his faith. He says, "Please, I believe, help my unbelief." Jesus then heals the boy. And when they're alone, his disciples ask why they failed so miserably. And Jesus says, because this one could only be cast out by prayer. But as we prepare to leave Jesus, I think the words that at least ring out in my mind are the ones Jesus cries out as he sees his disciples' failure to cast out this demon. He says, "You faithless generation, how much longer must I be among you? How much longer must I put up with you?" And we wonder this ourselves as we wait to continue the story. So that's what you have to look forward to in week 8. A lot. And yet there's something that always brings me hope in the book of Mark. No matter how much the disciples fail, no matter how much they struggle, no matter how little they understand, Jesus still claims them as his disciples. claims us as well. Well, I'd love to hear from you with any questions or to hear how I'm doing. If you'd like to contact me, please feel free to contact me at dshub@trinitywestbend.com. Until next week, God bless and good reading.